Today I want to show you how to make my favorite sticky bun recipe. This is a perfect recipe for a holiday morning, and you can prep it the night before and then put it in the refrigerator to bake the next morning so you have these delicious sticky buns for your holiday breakfast. The dough for this recipe is my enriched dough master recipe, which is just a really basic yeast bread recipe that you can use for dinner rolls, cinnamon rolls. You can use it for any kind of sweet bread, and it makes this really soft and slightly chewy dough. So in our mixing bowl here, I am going to start with 1 cup, which is 227 grams of warm milk. This is just slightly warm. You don't want it to be hot, somewhere around 110 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's too hot for you to touch, it's way too hot for your yeast and you're going to kill the yeast. So to my milk, I'm going to add 1 package, which is 7 grams or 2 1/4 teaspoon of yeast. And this can be active dry yeast or rapid rise yeast. The only difference between the two is how quickly your dough is going to rise. And to this, I'm also going to add a really big pinch of sugar. You want to add maybe about a 1/2 teaspoon or so. And there is some sugar that's going into our recipe later, so I'm just pulling from that bowl. And I'm just going to mix this together, and we are going to let this sit for about 5 to 10 minutes until it looks really foamy. This is called proofing your yeast. And what this does is it kind of gives your yeast a little bit of a jump start so that when you add the other ingredients into your dough, the yeast is awake and it is moving for you and your dough is going to rise a little bit faster. The other thing that it does is it's a little bit of an insurance policy for you to check that your yeast is actually alive and active. I have let this yeast mixture sit for about 5 minutes and I'm starting to see a lot of foaming. It almost looks like it's being carbonated. There's these little bubbles kind of popping to the top, and that's because the yeast is feeding and creating CO2 gases. So that is a visual indicator that I can go ahead and move on with my dough because my yeast is alive and active. Once you confirm that your yeast is nice and active, you can go ahead and just add all of the rest of your ingredients right into your mixing bowl. There really is no order that this needs to be in. We're just gonna go straight in. So I have here 480 grams, which is 4 cups of all-purpose flour. And I prefer to use unbleached flour whenever I'm making bread because it does build a bit of a nicer gluten structure. You could also use bread flour if you really wanted to. Now I do have some more flour off here to the side that I'm going to hold back adding to my dough. When I need my dough, I will add a little bit more as the dough needs it. We had 50 grams, which is a 1/4 cup total of granulated sugar. I also have 85 grams, which is 6 tablespoons of unsalted butter, and this butter is really nice and soft. And then I have 2 large eggs. And then our last ingredient is 7 grams or 1 1/2 teaspoons of salt. And I prefer to use kosher salt, but you can use fine sea salt if you prefer. You just want to use the weight because that's going to be the same no matter which salt you're using. Now I'm going to use my little rubber spatula here and just start getting this incorporated together. I just want to get the flour starting to absorb into the liquid, and then we are going to turn it out on the counter and knead it. I actually like to take clean hands and just go right into the bowl and kind of start squeezing the dough and really making sure all of that flour is getting incorporated before I turn this out onto my work surface. This is going to be quite a sticky dough, and that's perfectly normal. Remember, we have some more flour we can work in here in a bit. Now at this point, I'm not super concerned about how evenly everything is mixed in because we're going to need this for quite a long period of time and it will get very well mixed during that process. If you have a stand mixer, you can put this in your stand mixer with the dough hook and let it knead like that, but you actually don't need any kind of specialty equipment to make bread dough. You can do it right on your counter. So I have a clean work surface here and I'm going to add some flour, and then I'm going to turn my dough out onto the work surface and knead it by hand. So you want to get a little bit of flour over the top of your dough, and then you can also flour your hands. And what we're going to do is just work this dough for probably about 8 to 10 minutes. Now I know that might sound like a long time, but you can take breaks. If you have a family member nearby, you can make this a little team project. And again, like I said, if you do have a stand mixer, there's no reason why you can't use your stand mixer. But I know a lot of people don't have one, and I want you to still have delicious sticky buns if you don't. So this dough is going to feel quite sticky, and it should be sticky. We're not trying to get it to the point where it has no stickiness at all, but we do want it to be manageable, and you want to be able to work with it without it completely gluing itself to your hands and to the counter. So as you need it, you can add a little bit more flour to the dough, to your hands. If you have a bench knife, this is super helpful to kind of help you scrape up the dough as it sticks. If you don't have a bench knife, you can use a metal spatula, like a metal turner, that can kind of help you. And I always tell people too that when you're kneading dough by hand, to really focus on going across the dough rather than down into the table. I notice sometimes people often like kind of push down into the table, and that's really going to glue it to the table. If you've never kneaded dough by hand, it does take a little bit of practice to get into a rhythm, but you're not gonna do it wrong. You're not going to hurt the dough. Just get in there, work with it, try to find a rhythm. And we're trying to build a really strong gluten structure so that our dough will hold all of those gases in as it rises and give us really nice and fluffy rolls. So after you have kneaded your dough for a good 8 to 10 minutes, you should have this really, really smooth, elastic dough. It should still feel nice and soft and sticky, but it's not gluing itself to my hand. It still has a lot of moisture in it though. We don't want this dough to get dry. So I'm going to gather this up into a nice ball, and I'm going to transfer it back into my mixing bowl, and I'm going to cover this and let this rise for about 1 hour if you used rapid rise yeast and 2 hours if you used active dry yeast. You do want this to about double in size before you go to shape it. So when your dough is almost finished rising, you want to prepare the topping for your sticky buns. And we are going to make this really simple caramel sauce. So I have here 200 grams or 1 cup of granulated sugar, and I'm going to put that in a saucepan over medium-low heat. You don't want to go too high with your heat. And then next we are going to add 120 grams, which is a ½ cup of water. And I want to make sure that all of my sugar is completely saturated, but I do want to be careful that I'm not getting sugar up on the sides of the pot, because that can actually make your caramel sauce crystallize. So I'm just making sure all of the sugar is saturated, and I'm going to let this sit now over medium-low heat until it comes to a boil, and then it's going to start caramelizing. So after the sugar starts melting, it is going to all come up to a boil, and then as the water evaporates off, that sugar is going to start caramelizing. And you really need to stay close to the pot when that starts happening, because it's going to move very, very quickly. You also need to make sure that you have your heavy cream ready to go. So I have 1 cup, which is 235 grams of heavy cream, sitting right here beside me, ready to go as soon as this gets a really nice golden brown. So another thing I do want to warn you about is that as soon as this caramel gets to the right color and I pour my cream in, I want you to kind of stand back away from the pot a little bit, because what's going to happen is it is going to really vigorously bubble up, and I don't want you to burn yourself. You'll also notice that my pot is quite a bit bigger than the amount of caramel that I'm making, and that is to help avoid it from splashing out of the pot when I pour the cream in. So pour it in, stand back for just a second, and then we're going to stir really vigorously with our spatula. Okay, I'm really happy with this color, so I'm going to very quickly and carefully pour the cream in and step back. Once I've given it just a second or two to rapidly bubble, then I'm going to come in and carefully stir with a spatula. If you have a really long handled spatula or wooden spoon, that's really helpful, because then your hands aren't going to get so close to that bubbling caramel. But I want to stir this for just another minute or two to thicken it up a little bit. We don't need to thicken it up too much, because this is going to cook in the oven with our sticky buns, so it will get thicker as it cooks in the oven. And we can also go ahead and add some salt in here. So I have a ½ teaspoon, which is about 2 grams of salt, and that is just going to really balance out the sweetness for us and give us a bit of a salted caramel flavor. So now that we have our caramel sauce made, we are just going to pour this into our 9 by 13 pan. And you can decide if you want to save a little bit of this to the side, you can, to serve over the top of the rolls, but this is going to become our topping. We're going to flip the rolls out of the pan once they are done baking, and the caramel sauce will actually drip down over them. So it should be a nice thin layer in the bottom of your pan, and then we are going to add our pecans. So I have 200 grams, which is about 2 cups of roughly chopped pecans, and I'm just going to sprinkle that evenly over the caramel sauce. Okay, so we can just set this aside while we fill and cut our rolls. Okay, so our dough is finished rising. It has doubled in size, and now we can roll it out and fill it. So I'm going to very lightly flour our work surface. You really don't need much here. And then I'm gonna turn my dough out onto it, and then go ahead and very lightly flour the top. And you want to go ahead and press all of the air out of the dough and kind of start it in a rectangular shape. It's going to be much easier to roll out into a rectangle if you start it in a rectangle. All right, and now we are going to use our rolling pin to roll this out into a really large rectangle. And as I'm rolling out dough, I always kind of pick it up and make sure that it's not sticking too much to the counter. You can see I kind of stuck here a little bit, so I'm going to add a little bit of flour and redistribute that under, and then keep rolling my dough. Sometimes when you're working with dough, it wants to really fight you and kind of snap back. If your dough is doing that, place a towel over it and let it rest for 5 to 10 minutes. That will let the gluten relax, and then it will more easily work with you as you roll it out. So once you get your dough rolled out, make sure it's not stuck to your counter, and then we can go ahead and fill it. So I have some melted butter here, and I'm going to pretty liberally brush this all over the top of my dough. I am going to leave just about a 1/2 inch border at the very top long edge of the dough, but I am going to go all the way to the sides and all the way to the bottom. So the filling for our sticky buns is really just the same as my cinnamon roll filling. The only difference is that I use a little bit less cinnamon because I want to focus more on the caramel and the pecan topping rather than so much cinnamon in the filling. So I have 1 cup, which is 200 grams of brown sugar, and then I added to that 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. In contrast, my cinnamon rolls have 3 tablespoons of cinnamon. They're very cinnamony, and they're very worth it. I'm just evenly sprinkling this all over the dough, again, leaving a border right at the very top. That's going to be where we seal the dough to make sure that it stays closed while it bakes. And you can use clean hands to sort of distribute this to make sure there's an even amount of filling all over the top of your dough. All right, now it is time to roll these up. So starting at the long end that is closest to you, we are going to start rolling this, and you want to keep it fairly tight. If you go too loose with your rolling, the filling will really seep out of your rolls as they rise. And when you get to the end, you should have this little border that doesn't have any filling, and we are just going to use that to pinch to seal it. Now we can cut our rolls. I like to use a really good serrated knife, and we're going to cut these into 12 pieces. So start in the middle and just cut your dough in half. Then I cut my 2 halves in half, so I have quarters, and then I cut each quarter into thirds. Now, if you want to be really precise about this, you could use a ruler and make sure they're all exactly even. I don't really get too caught up in that. I just try to do my best to make them as even as I can. Once you have your rolls cut, all you're going to do is transfer them on top of your pecan caramel topping. And I kind of press them down a little bit. That kind of helps fill in the swirl so that if it wasn't super tightly rolled, it will help keep the filling inside a little bit. Once your rolls are in the pan, you do want to put plastic wrap right over the top of them and kind of press it down on top so that it's touching the rolls. That will really help them not dry out. And then you have 2 options. You can let these rise at room temperature for about 45 minutes until they're really puffy, or you can leave them out for about 30 minutes and then put them in the refrigerator to stay overnight, and you can bake them the next morning. These can stay in the refrigerator for 12 to 16 hours before you bake them. So if you did choose the overnight option for your sticky buns, you do want to take these out of the refrigerator about 1 hour before you are going to bake them. You can also set them beside your preheating oven if your kitchen is really cold, which will help them finish rising a little bit. Remember, the refrigerator is really going to slow things down, so we need to get the yeast to wake up a little bit before we do bake them. Now you want them to look like they have risen at least about 50% in size. They should look really nice and puffy, and we can go ahead and bake these at 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 degrees Celsius for 30 to 35 minutes. So once you take your sticky buns out of the oven, you do need to be ready to go with your platter because you need to flip them out of the pan pretty quickly, like within the first 5 minutes of taking them out of the oven. So you're going to very quickly just tip them out, and please be careful. I don't want you to burn yourself. But all of that delicious caramel and pecans becomes the top. And oh my gosh, the name sticky bun is perfect because that's exactly what these look like. If you have extra caramel sauce, you can drizzle some more on top, but these are best served straight from the oven right when they come out. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure you give it a like and make sure you are subscribed so you never miss a video. If you have any questions, you can always leave those down in the comment section. I do my best to answer them. And if you try this recipe, let me know how it goes. I love hearing from you and hearing how everything has turned out for you. I'll see you next time with another recipe tutorial. Bye.